Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we're diving into the life and career of Tammy Wynette, so stick around. All right, but first, I've got some dates coming up, so come out and see me. So, June 8th, I will be at the Knights Ferry Art and Music Festival in Knights Ferry. And June 19th, I will be at Tano's, I think that's in Orangevale. And June 20th, I will be at the Red Bus Brewing back in Folsom. So, come on out and see me. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some big news coming up here. So I have started an Indiegogo campaign to produce and launch my next single called To Be Enough. And I'm very passionate about this project. It's one of my favorite songs I've ever written. And I'm going to give it 100% effort here to get this thing professionally done, released, and promoted across all the different social media platforms and everything else. Kind of put all my eggs in this basket for now and see how far I can take it. But for that to work, I need public support, and that can be found on my Indiegogo page, which can be found on my Linktree, which is through either my TikTok or Instagram account. If you go to my links, my Indiegogo campaign is the top one, and I would love and appreciate any support that you guys feel like giving, and we're going to try to make a real go of this thing. So please, if you don't mind, check that out, and hopefully I'll see you soon. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at TylerandCo_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything, when he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Okay, so Tammy Wynette, we spoke a little bit about Tammy Wynette in our George Jones episode, because she was a big part of the George Jones story, but George Jones is not as much of a part of the Tammy Wynette story. Her life and career are crazy, and so she eventually becomes known as the queen of country music, and when she's married to George Jones, it's like the king and queen of country, but that is not where she starts. She starts off in Mississippi. And I will say, as we get into this, Tammy Wynette's story is kind of clouded by her and other people, but a lot of her propensity to embellish stories. So, she'll tell a story that you think you're getting it straight from the horse's mouth, but then other people that were there will all tell a different story. And, making it seem that she really does kind of embellish stuff sometimes. And she had this kind of wild, attitude towards public interactions. But so she starts off in Mississippi, and her life begins with some tragedy, right off the bat. So when she's born in 1942, her dad already knew that he had a brain tumor and he was going to die young. And it started to get really aggressive right after Tammy was born. So basically there's, you can imagine this guy who knows he's dying has an infant daughter, and he's trying already to instill music or a love of music into that kid, because he had musical aspirations of his own. And some of his last positive memories, and because Tammy Wynette barely remembers her dad. I guess she doesn't. She was like a year old when he died, I think. But her mom would say that the last positive memories of her husband were of him sitting at the piano with baby, Wynette. And so she's born Virginia Wynette Pugh is her name. The name Tammy doesn't show up till way later. So, but everyone calls her Wynette. So, dad and baby Wynette at the piano, and he's like putting her fingers on the thing, and, they're singing and having a good time. So quickly thereafter, he goes blind because of this brain tumor and then dies within like a year or so of her being born. And so that, like I said, she's born into pretty quickly, a pretty tragic situation. That being said, her grandparents jump right in and seem to have been the structure in her life to the point where she calls her mother, and she calls her grandfather and grandmother mom and daddy. Like that's the relationship, is she's pretty much raised by her grandparents, even though her mom is around. And her childhood is really, if you look at it, great. I mean, she in later stories, she kind of makes it sound like she grew up poor or that she like came from nothing. And that's not really the case. Her grandfather was, I think his name was Chester Russell, I think. And he was like a pillar in that small community in Mississippi. He was like, he owned like 600 acres or something, and he, ran this farm. So he employed a lot of people, and he, did the work himself. Like he's out there on a tractor, like in the field. Like everybody loved this guy. He was a hardworking dude, and he employed a lot of people. And there's stories of him, he was like the only guy in town who owned a truck, and he would just get up at like 2:00 in the morning if the neighbors called him. Like in one case, somebody's wife needed to go to the hospital for something, and Tammy Wynette's grandpa like gets up at 2 a.m, drives to the neighbor's house, throws his wife in the truck, and takes her to the hospital. And that seems to be an example. Like that didn't stand out as like the nicest thing he ever did. He did stuff like this all the time, and everybody around, loved that guy. And he seems to have been a very positive impact on Tammy Wynette. And to the point where, so Tammy's living with her grandparents, and it starts off where so the grandparents are sleeping in separate rooms, which I guess was kind of normal, in that time and place. But because the house was, relatively small, Tammy grew up sleeping in the same bed as her grandfather. And that happened until she hits puberty, and he tells her, okay, no, that's it. Like kicks her out, gives her her own space. But that seems to be like, my brain grabbed onto that interaction as I think that might be the start of some problems. Because not only had she lost her biological dad early on, so she grows up knowing that she doesn't have her biological dad, but then she has this kind of formative year experience of she hits puberty and then is like, removed from this situation that she, she probably found some safety, like sleeping with an adult that close. And, as a little kid, like to be told, hey, you're too big for this now. Here's your own space. You're off by yourself. Just judging from some stuff she does later, I think that might have been more of a formative moment than is obvious. Because very quickly after that happens, she goes from being, cute, fun little Wynette to being a little bit of a hellion. And she starts giving her mom and grandparents quite a bit of hell going through high school and in the next several years. So, actually, and not only that, but the idea of her working on the farm will come in important later. Because like I said, she kind of uses that in the story as like, I came from X, Y, and Z. She definitely did grow up picking cotton and working different, fields and things, but it wasn't because she had to. It was because her grandfather wanted her to have that experience, so he made her go do it. It was like he owned the place, and he made her go work on the farm because he wanted to instill those, values in her. It wasn't like Johnny Cash and his family where they were dirt poor, and if everybody didn't work, they didn't eat kind of thing. That is not where Tammy Wynette starts off. She's in a very stable household with the guy that owns the farm, and he just wants his granddaughter to develop a work ethic. So, but like an example of the leeway that she gets, she wanted to go, I think there was a show at the theater in town or something. There was this show she wanted to go see. And her grandfather told her, all right, if you pick your so many pounds of cotton by 2 o'clock, we'll go. And he said specifically, do not put rocks in your bag. Like, that was like a known thing, is you don't put rocks in the bag of cotton because it'll screw stuff up in the separating machines. Well, Tammy Wynette, who is rather impulsive and apparently in a hurry, decides, I'm going to put rocks in my bag anyway. So she fills the bottom of her bag up with rocks, picks enough cotton to make it look like she did a good job, takes it to the processing shed, and just dumps it in the machine, like weighs it, writes the thing down, dumps it in the machine, and leaves. Well, I think she's like 12 at this point, or so, maybe 12, 13, somewhere in there. Well, after she leaves, she goes back to the house. She turns around to see her grandfather running out to get on a tractor. She turns around the other way, and there's a bunch of smoke coming from that processing shed because she'd thrown all those rocks in the machine, and when you do that, it starts a fire in the cotton that you picked. And she burned hundreds of pounds of cotton because she was being lazy about having to pick so many pounds. So the story is that her grandfather whips her down with a cotton stalk and gives her one of the worst beatings of her life, but they still go to the show after. So that's the environment she's in. It is very strict, but she still seems to get what she wants most of the time. And anyway, and her mom is still sort of this satellite parent figure where, she does have a lot of influence still, and she brings into the equation a lot of pressure and a lot of, standards to live up to. And so, anyway, high school, Tammy Wynette, or, Wynette Pugh still at the time, she's a popular girl in high school. She has no trouble making friends, and she's also very popular with the boys, and that gets her a reputation relatively quick. She had a reputation in school for, she would go on dates with anybody. It wasn't like she only stuck to outgoing jocks or anything. She would take dates with, the quiet, awkward guys as well, and so she was kind of known for just... And she would also then come back and make up stories about what happened, all these wild... It was kind of like the... She was like a tabloid in a way for that small time, but she loved it. She loved being this center of attention, and she would embellish all these stories and tell her friends about all this stuff that happened. So pretty quickly, she becomes known as this worldly character who knows her way around, the dating apparatus. And it starts to get her in a little bit of trouble. I mean, even though up to a certain point, everything seems to have been innocent, that dating back then, it didn't have the same assumptions that it might now. And it seems to have been relatively innocent most of the way through her high school career. But she goes through a bunch of rebellious fate. She decides she wants to get married at one point, and I think she's 15 or something. And she orders rings in a catalog. And there's a moment where word gets around town that, oh, well, Wynette's getting married. And with that word reaches her grandfather, who's in the hardware store or something, and someone's like, oh, hey, I heard Wynette's getting married. He says, what? When is that happening? And then, so that basically what happens is then grandma intercepts this package of rings that Tammy had gotten delivered to the school instead of her house. So somehow, the jig is up, grandparents find out and force her to break up with this guy she was dating. But that became kind of par for the course. Is that level of she's fantasizing about eloping and running off really quick. And so, then other stories start to develop about, she got the nickname Wynette, spelled W-I-N-E, because apparently there was a lot of drinking going on at these parties she was having, and she got a reputation for that, which would stick with her later. Anyway, so then we get to the Bird family. So the Bird family was this collection of brothers and sisters that lived in the same town in Mississippi. And the older brother's name was DC Bird. And Wynette quickly developed kind of an infatuation with this guy. He was much older. I think he was like 11 years older than her or something, which would also be a theme later. But so he's much older than her, and he's also married. And he's going through this weird phase now. So this is when she's late 16, early 17, I think. So she's meeting up with this guy in the woods, every once in a while, and kind of words getting around town that these two are a thing, even though he's married. And then there's this really awkward scenario where, like, he gets divorced, starts dating Wynette, and then kind of like breaks it off with her. And while they're on like a spotty, they're kind of still seeing each other, kind of not, he gets remarried to the lady that he got divorced from. And it kind of crushes Wynette's, image of him, because, she at the time was thinking they were getting married. That was what she wanted. She's, like I said, she's 16, 17 years old at the time. So when that, he gets remarried and it's obviously over, somehow in short order, she starts dating and quickly marries that guy's younger brother named Upal Bird. Now, Upal Bird gets a bit of a bad rap, depending on what documentaries you watch and what books you read. And they later did like a docuseries, I think, where they really portrayed the Bird family as these like toothless hillbillies that, just couldn't hang kind of thing, and were trying to put Tammy down. But the actual, like, the truth seems to be much different than that. So basically, Tammy gets married to Upal, and they have kids really quick. So I think they had 3 kids together. And she quickly goes, like, this is where she starts, she goes to beauty school. So she's getting her cosmetology license or whatever. And they move around a lot, and Upal's getting the reputation as a guy that can't hold a job. And their marriage is obviously really strained really fast. It's very toxic. But, and like I said, in later tellings, just make this guy, they tell the story in like the least charitable light possible as far as the Bird family goes. Well, the truth seems to be that Tammy's the one that kept wanting them to move. She kept bouncing from town to town. And that's sort of held up by the fact that later, when they get divorced, Upal Bird has no trouble holding a job in his hometown. Like, he has a stable life, after a while. And ironically, we're jumping kind of far ahead in the story here, but later on, Tammy Wynette declares bankruptcy, like late into her career, like later forward in the 80s. Upal Bird had re-entered the picture, sort of like, because they have kids together. He's still around. When he dies, he leaves those girls money from 3 different life insurance policies. So he ends up leaving the kids more money than Tammy Wynette does later. But that's, like I said, that's many, many years down the road here. But this is, just have that in your cap as like that's this type of guy we're dealing with. He's getting a really bad rap as this dude that can't hold a job and he's moving all over the place. But Tammy does seem to be the driving force behind that. And so, anyway, so their relationship starts to fall apart. And there's this, I think they divorce. Now, okay, so there's some drama that happens in this phase of the story. So, let's see here, because I think they had just moved. They moved around a bunch, but they never went to Nashville, or at this point, they hadn't gone to Nashville together. So we're in 1964, 65. So she decides to get divorced from, and it had been like, it wasn't like a clean break. They had like separated, got back together, separated. Actually, they separated, got back together. She gets pregnant and they have another kid. Then they get divorced. And when they get divorced in the middle of, I think she might have been pregnant at the time. I think their last kid might not have even been born yet. And that kid, so the last child, whose name I wrote down but is not on the page in front of me, is born with like spinal meningitis or something. So she's born premature and severely ill. And so while this, there's a phase of time here where Tammy is just beset on all sides by, she's got this sick premature infant in the hospital. Her marriage is ending. It was a toxic mess at the time. Like they're rumors of violence and all kinds of stuff going on here. Like they're cheating on each other and the whole thing. So it was a very, very, very messy time. And to the point where in their last fight, or like the last death throes of this relationship, it devolves into this screaming match. And also, another thing that you should add to the mix here is Tammy Wynette's already having health issues of her own. She's getting kidney infections, she's having gallbladder issues, and she's going through medical procedures on to like fix these things. And that's also how she starts to develop a dependency on painkillers, which will also become a trend. I mean, everybody in Nashville was on painkillers at the time, but she got there through actual, like real medical problems that she was attempting to treat. So knowing that she's already got a bunch of health issues, she's probably addicted to pills already, her marriage is falling apart, they have this last screaming match, and she has a complete mental breakdown. And she ends up hospitalized. So Upal takes her to the hospital and basically tries to have her committed. And she had a kidney infection at the time that was like really flaring up. So she was like, you can imagine she's got a fever. She's already like in full kidney infection mode. Then she gets in this marriage ending fight and they're screaming at each other. And she just ends up like wailing in a puddle on the floor. She can't even talk hardly. And so, as if that wasn't bad enough, for whatever reason, the conventional wisdom at the time, when she shows up at the doctor, is Tammy needs shock treatments. So somebody decides that it's a good idea to take this woman who's in this scenario that I just described and just juice her with some voltage now and again. And, which is a wild thing to hypothesize now. Although the weirdest part of it is that Tammy looks back on that and was like, well, that was painful, but it was very helpful for me. So whatever they were doing, I mean, I don't know. They don't use that therapy anymore for a really good reason, but she doesn't look back on it as having been abusive, which anyway. So she's had this mental breakdown. She's getting shock therapy. Right after that happens, Upal has, while she's gone, has cleaned out their apartment and took the kids. And so Tammy comes home to find this empty apartment, and she's again just crying in a puddle on the floor when there's a knock on the door and it's a police officer. And she assumed that he was like there to help somehow. Come to find out that was not the case. Upal had called them and they were there to arrest Wynette for being an unfit mother, which I didn't know was a thing you could arrest somebody for, but apparently in Mississippi in 1965, that was something you could get. And so they take her to the police station and then they try to have her committed, but then her doctor, who had just gotten done shocking her a bunch of times, I guess, like shows up and kind of vouches for her mental health. And he's like, no, she's not crazy. She's fighting off an infection. She's been going through all these therapies. So she ends up like not getting any legal action out of this. So she gets arrested, brought down to the station. The doctor vouches for her and then she walks this off. So then there's a bizarre cat and mouse game that start happening because, and this also, by the way, this is another weird phase of time here where her mom had sided with Upal. For whatever reason, her mom had decided that Upal was the stable one in the relationship and that the kids should go with him. And her mom really starts to work to undermine her claim to custody of her kids. And which would be a sore spot for a long time. So quickly thereafter, there's this kind of cat and mouse game where Tammy's driving around the neighborhood, sees her kids playing in Upal's front yard, pulls up, kids jump in, and she leaves. Like she just grabs her kids and takes off. And basically moves to Nashville with her kids. And that becomes quite the issue. Now, there's a weird time here where Upal doesn't seem to fight this very hard. Like initially he does, but then after a while he sort of falls off. But then enough time goes by that they decide to give it another shot. So there's a minute where Upal is living in Nashville with Tammy Wynette, like, you know, right at the end of that phase here. So this is 1965, 66. Because at this point, for whatever reason, all up to now, she's been interested in music, but has not been pursuing it as her career choice. Like I said, she went to hairdresser school, and that was her main, you know, orientation. But somewhere in here in the early 60s, she starts to pick up the idea to commit herself to music full time. And so she moves to Nashville, and she does one of these, you know, crazy Hail Marys where she's like a single mom with 3 kids. She just moves to a town where she doesn't know anybody and just starts trying to make it. And she ends up in like a small band that's like playing just tiny little shows, including shows like at either somehow attached to this, I think it was a Motel 6. Now, one of the guys that works in this Motel 6 is a guy named Don Chappell. And Don Chappell was simultaneously, he was an employee of this, I think it was a Motel 6. And he was a songwriter, like booking agent, producer guy. He was doing the music scene thing on, like, you know, at the same time. So he simultaneously serves as her connection to the music industry, you know, and he's seemingly well plugged in. Don Chappell goes on to have plenty of successes of his own on the writing front. But at the time, he's doing that as a side hustle, and he's working for this hotel. And one day in 1965, 1965, Wynette Pugh is performing at his hotel, or, you know, or whatever little venue is attached to it. And she ends up inviting him to her hotel room. That turns into a several day fling. And somewhere in there, because I guess when you worked for that hotel, you got your own room. And so at one point, Don Chappell brings Tammy Wynette to his room, which was against the rules, but they're in there having their, you know, fling going on for days at a time. Eventually, the owner of the hotel's knocking on the door like, "Do you have a woman in here?" And he's like, "Do you want me to tell you the truth?" And the owner of the hotel's like, "Yeah, dude, you're fired. Like, you can't do that. You can't have, this is not happening. You're fired." And Don Chappell supposedly fires back at him like, "Whatever, I'm going to buy this place in a week. She's going to be a star." And he was right about half of that. She was a star. He did not go buy that hotel a week later. But anyway, so the two of them stick together for a while here. So now it's Tammy and Don Chappell. And the way Don Chappell tells the story, at one point he drives Tammy back to her house to her apartment to get her things for somewhere else they were going. Well, Don Chappell didn't know Upal is in the house with the kids, and he had assumed they were, which they were divorcing, but I guess it wasn't totally final yet. And but Don Chappell recalls feeling like he almost got killed because he didn't know that her husband was in the house, and he just got done spending a week with her at this Motel 6 or whatever. And anyway, so they pair up and they get married later. And like I said, the divorce from Upal is messy, but it goes through a messy phase, and then he's out of the picture for a while, and he's got like very little input on the story for many years. So she gets married to Don Chappell, and right around the same time, this is where you enter another character, Billy Sherrill. Now, Billy Sherrill is a guy that we are going to do probably a whole episode on, because this dude is tied in to everybody. Now, this is early in his career, so Billy Sherrill was kind of an unknown producer guy. He had one hit on the radio at the time, which I can't remember which one it was. But anyway, so he's a name, but he's relatively new to the scene when Tammy Wynette goes knocking on his door, because she's just door knocking at this point. And even with Don Chappell, who had some songwriting credits and had some good connections in Nashville, they're basically broke at this point. Like, after they get married, there's a dry spell here for, you know, a few months where, you know, she's door knocking every place on Music Row and getting turned down every day of the week, to the point where she has decided she's going home. They're going back to Mississippi. The music thing didn't work. She's going to go back to doing hair, and that's it. Like, we're done here. But she had given herself like a couple more chances. She's like, all right, we're going to try one more time. I'll go door knocking and see if I can make something work. She knocks on Billy Sherrill's door. And initially, Billy Sherrill hears, she plays a couple of songs for him, and he immediately recognizes the greatness in her voice, the potential there, and he knows that she can make it, but he's not sold on her songwriting quality or the selection of songs that she picks to cover. Like he's not quite sure she has some star power there yet. But so he tells her basically, hey, if you find something a little bit better, bring it back to me. I'll listen to you again. Which Tammy at the time took that to mean, oh, don't call me, I'll call you. Kind of a turn down. But Sherrill really did mean it when he said, yeah, bring me, when you have better stuff, come back and I'll listen to you again. Now, it's also worth noting here that after her meetup with Don Chappell, like when she marries Don Chappell's the one, I believe, that tells her to start using the name Tammy Wynette. It's either Don Chappell or Billy Sherrill, actually. It's right in here in this same time, though, that she drops the Pew name and starts performing as Tammy Wynette. So from here on out, instead of bouncing back and forth, I'll refer to her as Tammy from this, this part of the story onward. So, but anyway, like I said, so she gets this conversation with Billy Sherrill, but something about it stuck with him, and he starts kind of asking around about her. And at this stage of the game, you got to remember that, like, Tammy Wynette was she's pretty, like, I shouldn't say she gets around, but it's not like she's some innocent, sweet, untouched by the world character. She's kind of been around the block at this point. And, and she had other affairs, like she was kind of cheating on Upel with other people, and that kind of, there was a kind of sordid, romantic story going on here. Well, part of that story is that some of these guys that she was door knocking pulled the whole casting couch maneuver, and she supposedly acquiesced, and then they did not do the things that they had implied they would do. So she's feeling very burned, and that's adding to the whole why am I even here? Let's go home to Mississippi kind of thing, because she's starting to receive some abuse on that front. Well, Billy Sherrill hears about this, and by all accounts, Billy Sherrill's a good dude. Like, he seems to be, this kind of pure-hearted artist character, and he's told that this had happened. Like, Tammy didn't tell him this. He'd heard it from somebody else, that there was this, like, casting couch thing going on that had gone sideways. And that pissed him off enough that he basically, like, there was I think it was a bass player or somebody that was there working a session for somebody else, and Billy Sherrill grabs him and is like, hey, would you mind staying for another session? I'm going to have this Tammy Wynette character come in here tonight at like 6, but I want you to be here. Basically, he wanted a guy there both as a musician, but also as another body, like another witness, to make sure to make Tammy feel comfortable, that she wasn't doing this like late evening meetup just with Billy Sherrill, because he knew what that would imply, and he knew she'd been through enough of that. So he sets, and kind of as a, almost purely because he hears this story and he's angry that the music industry had treated Tammy Wynette this way, he decides he's going to fix that problem, grabs another musician. So he sets up a meeting where Tammy can feel safe, invites her back, and this is where Tammy Wynette's career gets a break. And she talks about, like, she was considering, like, literally she's at home when she gets this phone call, like, looking at her belongings, like, getting ready to pack up and go home. Like, this, she's done. If Billy Sherrill hadn't called her, we would not know who Tammy Wynette is today. So, sure enough, she comes down, and they proceed to go on a run of successes that will last decades. And that's partly due to, because that's Tammy Wynette's initial success, not just because of that interaction, but also her talent paired with Billy Sherrill's talent, because he's writing a bunch of songs and producing stuff for her. He's a real powerhouse behind Tammy Wynette. So between the two of them, all this success starts pouring out here. And this is in so we're still in 1967. Now this is where 1968, so she's married to Don Chappell. She's starting to get some musical success. She releases Stand By Your Man, which becomes this icon. I mean, that's probably her most famous song to this day, which, is kind of ironic because what's funny about there's two characters. So there's Loretta Lynn and there's Tammy Wynette, and they later become friends, but their public and personal images were sort of flipped, where Loretta Lynn sings all these rebellious women's empowerment stories, but she's in a stable marriage that lasts her entire career. Tammy Wynette is singing Stand By Your Man and all these kind of traditional family values type songs while she's burning through marriages. I mean, I think she ends up with 5 marriages before the story's over. But so there's this conflict of, personal life and public facing image. And the more you look into that, the more complicated it gets. But anyway, Stand By Your Man slingshots Tammy Wynette into success and fame. And this is where you start to get the kind of tension, jealousy stuff going on between her and Don Chappell. And the trend with Upel and Don Chappell and everybody else that's coming in the story is Tammy Wynette keeps getting herself into abusive relationships with alcoholics. That seems to be her MO. And Don Chappell was no different. And it leads to the famous story that I brought up in our George Jones episode, where here in I think it was 68, she is having a fling with George Jones at this point. So George Jones is introduced to her by Don Chappell. Somehow on the corporate end, Chappell meets Jones. They have a working relationship. He's writing songs for George Jones, and he introduces him to Tammy. Well, George takes Tammy on the road, and that's great success. And then they start an extramarital affair, which goes completely under Don Chappell's nose. And he later jokes that he should have seen that coming, because Tammy Wynette used to have a notebook. She idolized George Jones from early on. He was this, he was this elevated figure that she was really after for a long time. And to the point where she had a notebook that was just her handwritten lyrics, where she would write down every song that George Jones ever released. She would write out the lyrics to it in this notebook. And if you think about that, in my mind, I don't think that's that easy to do with records. It's not unless you just keep skipping back, you have to listen to the whole thing over and over and over and over and be writing these lyrics down. And, so she does. Anyway, so she's obviously got an infatuation with George Jones. Don Chappell did not pay enough attention to that, and he sends his wife on the road with him. And that, culminates in this late night dinner party where it's just Don Chappell, Tammy Wynette, and George Jones eating dinner. Don Chappell says something mean to Tammy. He calls her a name or something. And George Jones decides, I don't like that, flips the table and just says that he's in love with Tammy, and grabs her and the kids. They get in Jones's Cadillac and they drive off and start this romance thing. We've told that story before, but so that's the context. This is already Tammy's second marriage at the time, and it's already devolving into the same sort of way the first marriage did. Now, I will say there's one more thing about Upel Bird. So from her first marriage, when they get divorced, right before, he says this snarky comment to her where Tammy Wynette hated the term hillbilly for whatever reason. That just stuck in her craw. She hated that term. And country music was kind of referred to as hillbilly music by people who were being dismissive. And that's how Upel talked about it. And so there's this interaction right at the end of their marriage. I think it might have been at their last meeting, their last interaction. He's like, "You're really going to stay here and do hillbilly music?" And she was like, "Yep, I'm going to make it. I'm going to be a star." And he just said, the exact quote I think was, "Keep dreaming, baby." and he leaves with this like last condescending note. So the last thing Yupel says to her as they're getting divorced is, keep dreaming. Well, a few years later, I think it was like 10 years later or something, that they had kind of become estranged. Like he stayed away for a while. Yupel goes to a show and waits in line for the meet and greet afterwards and gets up to Tammy and asks her to sign a picture. And she kind of just treats him like a fan. Like she doesn't really, say too much to him. And she signs that picture, keep dreaming, baby, signed Tammy, Wynette, and gives it back to him and sends him on his way. And so that's, she kind of got her revenge a little bit in that case. Like, imagine seeing your ex-husband, like, just walking up, like, making him wait in line with the rest of the fans. I'm sure she saw him ahead of time, but she made him wait in that line, got all the way to her, and then she burns him down with this, quote from years before. But that was pretty par for the course for Tammy Wynette, it sounds like. She goes on, marries Don Chappell, ends up with George Jones, quickly divorces Don Chappell, and gets married to George Jones. And this is kind of where we hit the highlight of the Jones and Wynette career, is they start working together. They start pulling off duets that are some of the best in country music history, even to this day. And remember, this isn't George Jones at his worst, but he's on the way there. His drinking's really bad, and he's causing enough of an issue. Something that I did not discover in my George Jones episode, at least, or maybe I wasn't looking for it very hard. George Jones, by a couple of accounts here, was physically abusive to Tammy Wynette there for a minute. He was a mean drunk, and it is not hard to believe, because he, we talk about George Jones shooting guns over the top of his friends' cars and getting in fights with people and just being a hellion about stuff. Well, and then I think a mistake that I probably made in the George Jones episode is that when he relapses and tells Tammy about it, she does not cut him any slack, and she basically tells him, nope, you're never coming in the house again. And at the time, I think I was a little bit harsh on Tammy Wynette about that decision, because in further reading, that interaction came after he had chased her around the house with a gun, and she had had enough. And that was, fair enough. So George Jones basically did exactly the same thing that Hank Williams did to Audrey. Like, I don't think he shot through the door at her, but he chased Tammy around the house with a gun, and that's, leading up to this decision to tell him, nope, done with you, get out of my house. And anyway, and that's also clouded by, she's still having a lot of health issues, and she, all through this story, even during the peak of their success, she's having surgeries for her kidneys and gallbladder and, all kinds of stuff. And she's developed her own nasty addiction to painkillers. So, George Jones' alcoholism, while it is a gigantic problem and it made him dangerous to be around, it's not like Tammy Wynette was just clean of all of addiction problems. She had her own addiction going, and the two of those things did not mix. And it got to the point where later her band would have the inside joke. They would say, is Tammy playing or is Virginia playing? Because remember, her name was Virginia Wynette Pugh when she was born. And so the band would kind of joke to each other, Virginia's here. And that meant that Tammy had taken so many pills that she was useless and that they would have to cover for her during the show. So they would have Tammy would give them hand signals behind her back. If she couldn't hit a high note, she would make a fist behind her back, and the backup singers would hit it for her and kind of cover. If she'd made some other, I think it was an open hand, meant get me off the stage as fast as you can. And they had this whole thing worked out to where if she was too pilled up, they could kind of rescue the show and make it not awful. But there's a couple of times where that doesn't work. And she ends up at one point she sloughs down in a chair mid performance, and is everybody kind of panics, and the band just kind of ends the song and the curtains come down and they haul her off stage like that. So she's doing the same kind of thing. George Jones is known for missing shows and causing a problem in much the same way, but Tammy's right there doing the same thing. She's also on pills. She's also addicted. She's all, it's not going well for a lot of this chunk of time here. Anyway, but her and George Jones also, so they have a daughter together. So I think that's kid number 4 for Tammy Wynette. And she, raises them with that same fierceness. She never for all of her faults, she seems to have taken being a mother very seriously. And, and there's also a weird, so some time has gone by. Upal has come back into the picture wanting a relationship with his kids. So he's being cool to Tammy, like, enough, because he's not there for that. He's there for his kids. To the point where Tammy and George's daughter has, like, all these positive memories of Upal, because for whatever reason, when Upal shows back up, he kind of takes, a liking to that young. He didn't want to leave her out, so when he brought Christmas presents for his 3 daughters, he would bring one for George and Tammy's kid also. And, like, they start to have this sort of amicable relationship to the point where there's pictures of all of them at Christmas together. And they're, seems to be relatively, I think that might have been after her and George Jones get divorced. But anyway, like, Upal starts to kind of, his personality and image seem to start kind of winning out in the long term, where he starts off as this, like, not supportive guy who can't hold a job, hillbilly dude. Time sort of proves him out as this dude who, like, is a somewhat stable human, and he's at least trying to be there for his kids. And when he dies, so Upal dies, I think, in a car accident in 1996 or something. And, like I said, George and Tammy, Georgette, I think is her name. Yeah. Georgette has, like, all these positive things to say about Upal and, like, cried at his funeral kind of thing. Anyway. So we're back into 1968 here. So she's married George Jones, and they go off, this is the highlight of both their mutual careers. And they're having hit after hit after hit after hit. Well, then George Jones relapses quite violently. That ends. And then there's this phase of time here too, where, like, this is the part of the story of George Jones, where when they split, he tailspins, and that's where he discovers cocaine and just starts ruining shows. This is the no-show Jones phase, and he's spiraling off. Well, while he's doing that, Tammy Wynette meets another husband here really quickly. She marries and divorces within, like, 45 days. I think they were married for, like, less than 6 weeks. A guy named Michael Tomlin, who was just, like, a real estate guy or something in Nashville. And it's like this whirlwind romance thing. They get married, and then they immediately get divorced. So that's marriage number 4 for Tammy Wynette. And she's catching all the shit from the public, where it's like, oh, Mrs. Stand By Your Man is on marriage number 4. And that stings. Like, she doesn't like that at all. Even though she's simultaneously, like, a very strong-willed person, and she's very, I don't know if I'd say secure, but she's unwilling to just tolerate unhappiness in her marriage. At the same time, she seems to just be desperate for male approval and the approval of her husband. So she wants to have a husband and she wants his approval, but she also is paradoxically attracted to these really toxic dudes. And they all seem to have a pattern, which is, like I said, they're all these, like, wild men, alcoholics that end up abusive. And so this guy doesn't seem to be that much different, and she pulls the plug almost immediately. Like I said, less than 6 weeks. Marriage number 4 ends. That was 1976. And then 1978. So her and George Jones got divorced, I think, in 1975. So this is just 3 years later. She marries a guy named George Ritchie. Now, George Ritchie you could look at that dude from a couple of different angles. Some people describe him as this, like, super positive force. And for context, these two stay married until her death 20 years later. So some people, and she sort of experiences another career bump later on, and George Ritchie is managing. So he jumps right in and is this positive force for her career. And, you could look at it that way. Other people peg him as another one of these abusive alcoholic types who was really kind of controlling. He wasn't just managing and doing a good job of her career. He was very controlling and very, like, not positive in that regard. So it depends on who you talk to. There are people who say nothing but good things about him and people who say nothing but terrible things about him. And it, you know, I'm sure the truth is some complicated, muddy mess in the middle. And, but anyway, so she's married to this guy. And this is where George Jones comes back into the picture later on. Because this is, remember, where we talked about in the George Jones episode how, like, he's out there hallucinating and talking to, like, Donald Duck and being this crazy... And his band is basically like, the only way we can get him back into reality is if we get him around Tammy Wynette, who was married to this guy at the time. Geez, his name just, like, jumped out of my brain. George Ritchie. Jeez Louise. So Tammy's already married to George Ritchie when George Jones is brought back into her orbit by his band, just trying to piece this guy back together because he's such a mess. But that does work, and they have another string of hits together. So a lot of their hits that came doing duets were after they had divorced, and she's married to George Ritchie, and then he later gets married again also. But this is that phase of their career. And things seem to go relatively well. This is where her career starts to get a little bit of a burnout. Like she's reached the peak of her fame and success, and things are going fine. Her husband, George Ritchie, is trying to manage her for long-term success, and it seems to be going okay, but the marriage itself is not great, and on the business end, things were not as good as they seem. Because even though so on the outside, they've got all this success going, but George Ritchie is not doing a great job managing the books, culminating in a bankruptcy in the 80s. I think it was 1988. Tammy Wynette has to file for bankruptcy because their money is just all over the place. And this is also the phase of time where, like, if you walked into Tammy Wynette's house, because like I said, she's the queen of country music now. Like, it doesn't get much more famous than that. And she would have, like, she had her house kind of set up almost like with themes. So she had a hairdressing parlor room next to her bedroom that she had to walk by every day. Because this whole time she keeps up her cosmetology license. Like, I don't know what the requirements for that were. But this whole 20-year period, she keeps it up as like a backup plan, which is hilarious because, you know, like, anyway. So she ends up filing for bankruptcy, but she's in this house where she's got this hairdressing room set up, and then she has a crystal bowl sitting on her coffee table, and I think the bowl itself costs like $1,500 or something, and it's filled with cotton from her grandfather's farm. As if to say, she's trying to draw the contrast, you know, of what I'll never forget where I came from kind of thing. It seems like she leaned into that pretty hard because, like I said, she does have a flair for embellishing stories. And that does not seem to have changed over her some of the stories she tells about her interactions with George Jones, the stories she tells about other things going on in Nashville, all the way down to stories she's telling about each of her ex-husbands to other people. Like, it's very common in the Tammy Wynette story for satellite people to be like, that's not what happened. Like, I was there. That's not at all, you know, it wasn't that bad, or it, you know, whatever. Like, there's a bunch of conflicting storylines that the theme sort of is Tammy liked to bend the truth a little. And like that, having the cotton in the bowl is like, she makes it sound like, oh, I came from sharecropping almost. And it was like, no, you grew up on a farm that your grandpa owned, and he just made you do chores because he wanted you to have a good work ethic. It's not like she was forced to be there for like financial reasons. But anyway, so, and the public is taking, you know, quite an interest in her at this time. So the more she gets interviewed and the more she's talking, the more these stories seem to kind of grow in their, you know, size and scope. Well, this is where you get a very strange occurrence. So they're also, at this time, she starts receiving, like, or at least she's describing being stalked, where, like, somebody cut the phone lines to her house. There was, like, fires set in her yard at one point. She describes being followed home from the grocery store, and, like, there's all this weird stuff going on that she lots of people at the time were unsure of how true that was, because it was kind of like all anybody was talking about as far as Tammy Wynette goes there for a while. But there seems to have been something, at least. Like she was scared, and she confided in her friends that, she was having all this anxiety because somebody's after her. Well, then sometime later, like not in a wave of that happening, like that happened over the years. Later, I think it was in let's see here, it would be in the 80s. I think it was in the 80s. No, it's 1978. Okay. So this is pretty soon after George Ritchie is on the scene, actually. And like I said, George Ritchie, depending on who you talk to, was either this great positive character or he was another abusive alcoholic. And I don't see any reason to doubt that second version of the story here. Here comes the big bump in the story, which is Tammy Wynette gets kidnapped. And she shows back up. The story is, I think she was at the grocery store. She gets kidnapped, beaten up, and dumped in a park. So by the time the story's out, she's back, and she's the one telling, oh, I just got kidnapped. And immediately people's snouts are out for some shenanigans here. Like it's, the tabloids pick it up, oh, Tammy Wynette, kidnapped and attacked or whatever. But immediately people are asking questions. There's like a bunch of holes in the story. She basically kind of pulled a Jussie Smollett thing is kind of what people have landed on. That because she really did have a broken cheekbone though, and so her eye is blacked and she did get beat up. The prevailing theory is that George Ritchie beat her up, and then she did that to sort of save public image because she had a black eye that she had to explain. So the actual truth of that is still, I don't think anyone's landed on a hard answer that, maybe she was kidnapped and beaten up and left in a park with no further injuries than that. But it seems more likely that this was staged and it was actually George Ritchie that did it. And so that sort of shines the light on exactly how that marriage was kind of working behind the scenes. But like I said, those two do stay married until she dies. But anyway, but there's some haziness around exactly what happened there. And anyway, but she, this is where into the 80s, so she declares bankruptcy in 1988 and then kind of starts to, dig herself back out of the hole here. And then in the 90s, she starts kind of getting a resurgence, not on the country music scene, but in pop music, because country music, for whatever reason, back then, even though you had all these female characters, like there's Dolly Parton and Loretta Lynn and, her Tammy Wynette and, Tanya Tucker and all these people are kind of around at the same time. Country music and the radio were still really picky about putting women on. And there was like a rule that you could not put two women in a row, like two songs by women artists in a row on the radio. They just would not do that. And so they're all kind of fighting for this side spotlight. But they're all friends and kind of communally in this struggle together. But it wasn't like country music was as welcoming to female artists as it is today. And that's, say what you want about country today. But even by today's standards, it was way worse. And so, like I said, what she does is she kind of steps out of country music and she says, well, if you're not going to put me on the radio, I'll go to somebody who will. And she starts working with all these other people. Like she works with Elton John and I think maybe not the Bee Gees, but I had a whole list of like pop artists at the time that she was working with. Anyway, so she starts to get some radio success in the late 80s and early 90s. On the pop charts, and as this like kind of not backup, but like she's duetting with all these other people and she's getting her name out there in the pop charts. And that's sort of her last blip of positive momentum, because like I said, even then she dug herself out of some bankruptcy, but I don't think she dug very far because she dies in 1998 and she had a blood clot in her lung. So she just like falls asleep in front of the TV at her house and she's only 55. Yeah, she was 55 years old. and she's just falls asleep in front of the TV and never wakes up. She's had a blood clot in her lung, and boom, Tammy Wynette's story is over. And like I said, at that point, Upel left more money to her kids than she did. So I don't think they had dug out of bankruptcy very far, if at all, at that point. But I mean, who knows? But that still, I mean, that does not really reflect her impact on country music. I don't know how you mismanage a fortune like that to the point where you die with almost nothing when you're 55. But George Ritchie seems to have done just that. So that's, sad and tragic. But so she I think posthumously put in the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1998, which like right after she died. And then let's see here. I thought there was one more. Let's see here. Anyway, but yeah, so, and when she dies, you got to understand that at the time, she was one of these people, like, there's only so many female artists. They had fan clubs that were fanatical. And it was, if you thought it was sad when Marty Robbins died, it was like that when Tammy Wynette died, entire groups of fans that were devoted to her, like sending her mail, and they had newsletters that were like all about Tammy Wynette, and like there are people following her around writing about stuff. So when she dies, it just pulls the cord on all of that stuff. And but anyway, so Stand By Your Man rings through the years as her, greatest success, even though ironically she ends up with 5 husbands before it's over. And she doesn't seem to have ever really like acknowledged the way she talks about it. It was like she was really trying to live up to that standard the whole time. It wasn't like she was like, oh yeah, well I just meant this for whatever. She didn't downplay it at all. I think she really did want to be that person and just wasn't. And she thought ill of herself the whole time. Like she felt embarrassed about having had 5 marriages. And then that song gets caught up in the political scene. Like Hillary Clinton at one point like disparages Tammy Wynette because of it, which was hilarious to me. But this is like while the Clinton Monica Lewinsky thing's going on, somehow Hillary Clinton like is disparaging Tammy Wynette for the whole Stand By Your Man thing, even though Hillary Clinton does just that. But whatever. So that kind of puts her back into the spotlight for a minute. And I think Hillary Clinton actually later apologized to Tammy Wynette because she had been sort of a political figure towards the end there. Like she actually performed for Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was an interesting character as far as the country music scene goes. Because if you remember, Ronald Reagan is the guy, he is the one that pardons Merle Haggard. And he's, Merle Haggard, George Jones, Johnny Cash, all these guys have performed for Ronald Reagan at this point. And you remember also, this is late Reagan in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. This is, late Reagan, so he doesn't exactly have all of his marbles either. And there's a picture where, like, so Tammy Wynette was known for, during shows, she would go down into the crowd as she was singing, and she said she would pick some random husband, and she would just melt him down, because she would, you pick some guy in the front row that's there with his wife, and she'd go over there and, like, sit on his lap and be singing songs and, just, like, making for awkward car rides home. That was what she loved to do that. And so she does this to the president of the United States. Like during a show, she goes over and sits on Reagan's lap right in front of Nancy Reagan and is doing the whole thing. Like she gets that feather in her cap that she like melted down the president in front of the first lady. And then Mr. Reagan took that a little too much to heart, because then later there's a picture where he plants a kiss on her, and like quite aggressively, and she like jokes about it with her, friends later. But there's a picture of Ronald Reagan planting a kiss on Tammy Wynette floating around somewhere. But anyway, she was that kind of lady. She just had a good time and knew how to push people's buttons. But anyway, so, and her, Stand By Your Man lives on as the kind of crown jewel of her career. But anyway, so that's Tammy Wynette. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.